tenerla es más entre nosotros, va a presentar todo eso. Pues el vagabundeo. El vagabundeo del pensamiento. Tu salud.
Okay, gracias, muchas gracias, Pedro. Usualmente, bueno, siempre quiero desarrollar mi vocabulario filosófico. Y desafortunadamente no tuve la oportunidad de traducir mi handout. Entonces, el handout está en inglés. Y voy a dar la charla en inglés. I wish I wasn't. Pero si alguna persona después puede hacer preguntas en español, podemos tal vez discutir en español. Tenemos una discusión bilingüe. Can you hear me okay?
No, you cannot hear that microphone. Your voice is deep.
Let's go here.
That one is good for the best.
Okay. Speak up. Okay. Sí, si hablo demasiado rápido en inglés, por ejemplo, por favor de decirme, porque sí es posible, desfacerme. Es posible. Okay. Ese es un proyecto que se llama Alto y Bajo en el corriente de consciente. High and low in the flow of thought. Y lo que quiero discutir hoy es un capítulo y medio de ese proyecto. Empezamos con William James. William James decía, the natural tendency of attention, when left to itself, is to wander to ever new things. Okay. And lo que quiero discutir is, in what ways can conscious attention be undisciplined by executive control? In what ways can it be undisciplined by executive control? And I find it useful to talk about what I'm going to call the chronological flow of thought, which we can think of as a kind of continuous succession of elements of conscious attention, or what I'll call a thought stream, corriente de conciencia. So when I say thought, I don't actually mean thought as opposed to perception or anything like that. I mean some very broad category of things. Any episode or activity that occupies any amount of conscious attention. So that will include perception, but will also include lots of other things, inner speech, inchoate thoughts even, imagery, feelings, wonderings as opposed to wanderings, like when you're wondering whether something is the case, even bodily actions, speaking, humming. So these are all elements of thought streams, just anything that's episodic and occupies some amount of conscious attention. So la categoría no importa. Okay, so I want to give you an example of an undisciplined thought stream. And this comes from this fictional character, invented by Christine Korsgaard, my colleague. So I'll read you how she describes this person whose name is Jeremy. Jeremy settles down at his desk one evening to study for an exam. Ay, tengo que bajar eso. Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to have to, this is going to take me too much time. A ver. Yes, por favor. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, Jeremy settles down at his desk one evening to study for an examination. Finding himself a little too restless to concentrate, he decides to take a walk in the fresh air. His walk takes him past a nearby bookstore, librería, where the sight of an enticing title draws him in to look at a book. Before he finds it, however, he meets his friend Neil, who invites him to join some of the other kids at the bar next door for a beer. Jeremy decides he can afford to have just one and goes with Neil to the bar. When he arrives there, however, he finds that the noise gives him a headache, and he decides to return home without having a beer. He is now, however, in too much pain to study. So Jeremy doesn't study for his examination, hardly gets a walk, doesn't buy a book, and doesn't drink a beer. If your reply is that Jeremy is a distractible adolescent and following desire is not always like this, Kant's reply in turn, she's talking about Kant in this paper, will be that it's only an accident when it is not. So this Jeremy is lacking a kind of thread linking his intentions to his intention-fulfilling behavior without any major interruption. So his evening is a sort of series of truncated paths, okay? Now, actually, there's a lot of different versions of Jeremy. We can picture a lot of different versions of Jeremy if this is all we know about him. So one version of Jeremy is anchorless, unable to settle on any course of action, and made uneasy by that fact. So like, what does he even want? Does he even know what he wants? I mean, each time he starts to do a thing, he does like another thing. Okay. But another version of Jeremy might be sort of intermediate, that he's not totally paralyzed or anxious or anything like that, but he just sort of sometimes can't orient to or complete specific tasks. But then if he rests a little bit or has a bout of anxiety or something, or some other kind of break, then he can. Okay. And then my favorite is a sort of highly motivated Jeremy. Now, I like him. I like him. So he does a lot of things eventually. He just does them discontinuously, a little at a time, in a kind of outwardly lackadaisical manner. So we can picture how one of these activated Jeremys might act when he gets home. So still contentedly lacking any internal pressure to regulate his behavior toward finishing a task, he starts washing his dishes and then notices that one of these dishes is chipped. Hay una pieza missing, no? Which prompts him to remember that he put that broken piece in the drawer, which he opens, finding the piece and some glue alongside a spare key to his apartment, las llaves. Recalling there used to be several such keys, he starts rummaging through the drawer looking for the other spares, comes across a bill, payment due tomorrow, and pays it online, feeling pleased that he avoided the late fee. Okay. So this Jeremy is activated, except he's activated in a kind of relaxed way. You know, the dish is unfixed, the keys are still scattered, but the bill is paid and he found the glue. He found the glue. So now for all of these Jeremys, all these different versions of Jeremy, if you just look at, I mean, Course Guard is interested in intention and action and so on, okay, but I'm not interested in that. Let's just abstract away from that and look at his pattern of attention. So for all of these Jeremys, his attention is never in the service of immediately resuming what he starts if the attention gets interrupted in the task, okay? And so these Jeremys, they show us what attempts to fulfill intention can look like within this dynamic mode of attention. Those attempts can be kind of patchy and discontinuous, sometimes discontinued forever. So the mode of attention in which the Jeremys operate, it facilitates, it enables switches to and away from anything that can occupy attention, not just tasks and goals and plans, which is Course Guard's concern, but also interests, questions, activities, thoughts in general. Now, there's a kind of disparaging, or I hear it as slightly disparaging label, pejorativa, you know, for the Jeremy's undisciplined mode of attention, and that's distractibility. So you see this word in the Course Guard passage. So here are these two psychologists, Gazzaley and Rosen, who have a recent book called The Distracted Mind. And they identified distraction as a culprit that distributes attention in a suboptimal way, relative to some standard of goal accomplishment, completing your goals. And they treat that standard as just commonsensical. Okay, so here's something they say on page 6. Distractions are pieces of goal-irrelevant information that we either encounter in our external surroundings or generate internally within nuestra propia mente. Okay. When it comes to distractions, our intentions are very clear. We wish to ignore them, to shut them out, suppress them, and carry on with attempting to accomplish our singular goal. That's what they say. Internal distraction is also sometimes known as mind wandering. All right, so I don't know, you read this and I don't know what it reminds you of, but you know, I can't help but think of these sort of like efficiency-obsessed capitalist economies, or even Stalin. I mean, very, very different way of orienting life. Remember, he jailed people for being idle. Just saying. Okay, but I'll let you think about those similarities if you want to. I'm really just mentioning them because they're kind of extreme examples of something we might see less extreme examples of. I'm not trying to scare anybody or anything like that, but my main point today is that this undisciplined dynamic mode of attention exemplified by the Jeremys, it actually promotes two kinds of potential benefits that are overlooked by these disparaging stances toward distraction. Okay, so the first kind of benefit is that actually, despite the way they talk about things, it actually can be pretty efficient. I mean, it can be goal-wise effective to sustain this sort of readiness for tasks on multiple channels. So I'm going to argue that. That's not going to take very long. But the thing I want to spend more time on is a second family of potential benefits, which is that mode of attention, whether or not it's effective, it can be kind of generative or accumulative in a way that I want to try to describe and see what you think. Okay. So when I say that this mode of attention, this sort of dynamic mode of attention, the way attention is unfolding through time, when I say it promotes benefits, I don't mean that it's like constitutively beneficial, that whenever you have or are in this dynamic mode of attention, these great things happen. I mean, that's kind of obviously not true. And I also don't think it's necessary for these benefits either. So there's a lot of contingency here, right? But for all its contingency, I think that you can find these kind of distinctive benefits and indeed pitfalls as well. Pitfalls, ¿cómo se llama eso? You know, like anti-benefits. You know what I mean? Pitfall is a weird English word. It sort of doesn't, you never know what verb to use. Otra vez, what is it called? That's right, exactly. Good. Yeah, that's much better in Spanish. Everything better in Spanish, right? What? Well, you can't have a verb because, like, what do you do to a pitfall? Like, you fall into the pit. I mean, it's already built into the word. You know what I mean? So that's why we only ever talk about being surrounded by the pitfalls or something, or avoiding them or whatever. That's why I don't like it. It's too efficient. That word is too efficient. Yeah. Okay, so what I want to do is just characterize the structural features that help us understand the kinds of cognitive, broadly speaking, operations and interactions among the elements of a thought stream when attention is undisciplined in this way. Thanks so much for doing that. It really helps, yeah. Okay, so here's the plan. I want to first let activated Jeremy, my favorite Jeremy, show us his effectiveness. That's not going to take very long. Okay, then I want to illustrate the undisciplined structure of attention and its potential benefits. And then I want to consider two different kinds of models of this sort of undisciplined thought under the label of spontaneous thought that are given by two different sets of researchers, Taxcali and Sripada, who have a certain model of spontaneous thought streams, and then Zach Irving's analysis of mind wandering. And I want to consider to what extent can those models of spontaneous thought streams capture this whole, both the nature of the undisciplined nature of the thought stream and the benefits. And I'm going to argue we actually need an analysis that's different from each of those models. And the crucial missing element, I'm going to argue, comes from a distinction between the chronological flow of thought, which, I don't know, back on the first page, I was saying that's the sort of continuous succession of elements of conscious attention, and the idea that there could be kind of thematic channels, thematically unified channels within it. Okay, so we have, if you think of like a channel, you know, one channel with all of your sort of passing conscious experiences over time. And then I'm going to, one big stream, let's call it a stream just to keep the word straight. A stream, no corriente, no importa. Then within that, there are kind of substreams encompassed within it that are thematically unified and perhaps overlapping. See what I'm saying? Okay, so that's going to be an important distinction that's actually not captured by either of these models as they stand. And that will help us. Okay, that's what I'm going to say. All right, so let's let activated Jeremy show us his effectiveness. So think about activated Jeremy, this guy who's sort of, oh, he goes to the bookstore, oh, now he's going to the bar, now he's going home, et cetera. You know what he's like now. Maybe you are activated Jeremy. So he's sort of hosting multiple threads of activity and readiness at the same time, like over the same interval of his evening. And all of his turns away from something are also turns toward something else that he is enthused to be doing, at least for the moment. He'd been meaning to glue that part back on the cup. And now he has energy for the task. Eso decimos en inglés. Ya tengo energía para hacer eso. Voy a hacerlo. You know, usually it's like some looming nuisance, you know, oh, I got to do this thing. But en ese momento, no, it seems, you know, parece una cosa fácil de hacer. Tiene una affordancia to do it. He has an affordance of doing it. So those affordances are like salient to him. And so he doesn't have to do advanced planning or anything like that on when to make it repair. So all of these tasks are like alive to him in his mind. He can orient to any of them, and switching between them causes for him no fatigue. So the next time he sees his amigo Neil, right? He's just ready to hang out, pick up where they left off. He still is interested in that book he saw in the bookstore. And if any of the spare keys turn up, he'll remember he wanted to put them all in one place. And that's going to happen too, maybe in 45 minutes or next week, sometime. So he's sort of making progress on many fronts. He identifies, this is why I like him, he identifies with his efficacy without experiencing all of these turns away from things left unfinished as defeat or inadequacy or limitations on his agency. Now, you could picture a different Jeremy who was actually just as effective, but didn't like himself or felt bad or saw himself through the eyes of Gasly and Rosen, So let's just leave him behind. Let's focus on the activated, self-accepting Jeremy. Okay. Now, it's absolutely correct that when you shift tasks, when you shift in between tasks, you run the risk of things kind of getting lost in transition. The transition between like working memory and long-term memory. So maybe you have una maleta y una bolsita. Okay, so the maleta, that's for things you're going to use like, a little bit later or over a longer period of time. La bolsita is for the things you get often, right? And so now if you're sort of always moving things in between la maleta y la bolsita, you could lose them or parts of them, if they're always shifting back and forth. Then memory could be like that too. If you're always having to move things between your working memories, like your bolsita, and the long-term memories like your maleta. Okay, so it's true that if you switch tasks a lot, it runs this risk. And you may know there is huge individual differences between people and how costly they find it to switch tasks. And you can see this in children. Sometimes with children, you'll make a plan with a kid, and then for whatever reason, the plan has to change and they freak out. Le molesta mucho. Pero otros niños no son así. They're easy. They're like, you can switch the task and they're like, oh, fine. So this is just an individual difference thing. How costly is it to do that? Now, it's also true that not all tasks can be done discontinuously. Okay. Sometimes, for example, cocinando, like you can't stop in the middle of an omelet and then cook it later. You can stop after you take out the eggs, but not like when it's in the middle of cooking. Not everything's like that. You know what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So now it could be that the Course Guard and other people who are interested in practical reason and intention, they might be right to say that if Jeremy never imposed some other part of himself on his whims or desire, like a second order desire or something, or a rational will, it might be true that he might never get around to doing anything. That might be true. That's okay. The mode of attention doesn't render him completely ineffective with respect to his tasks or plans or projects. The issue is whether he can spontaneously impose that other part of himself on his whim. That's the issue. Okay, so that's why I think that actually he's not necessarily ineffective. He's not necessarily ineffective just purely in virtue, just because he has this undisciplined mode of attention where he's distractible. That does not mean he's not going to get anything done. It just will be temporally structured in a different temporal way. All right. Okay, now I want to switch to talking about this other family of potential benefits of this mode of attention. And that will bring us also to the potential pitfalls. Yeah. And instead of talking about an example where the truncated streams of thought are the ones linking intentions to intention-fulfilling behavior. In this set of, I want to talk about a different example that involves a conversation. So en inglés tenemos esa generación de jóvenes. Han creado una palabra que se llama lit. It's como en fuego, right? And it's a great word because it took me a while to figure out what they were talking about. But once I figured it out, like it really does mean sort of on fire. And then all of the metáforos that go with that. Okay, so here's a type of conversation I want to describe to you. It's a conversation that generates thought streams intersubjectively. So when you talk to people, I have a thought stream, you have a thought stream, and we each have our own thought streams, but of course they're heavily shaped, if we're paying attention to our conversation, by what one another is saying and whatever else may be going on in the backgrounds of our minds. So there's a type of conversation where it flows along very easily. One topic leads into another topic. Each speaker says something. This is the lit part, en fuego part. that the other finds interesting, wanting to think about, wanting to pay attention to. And that prompts them to introduce a related theme that takes the conversation in a new direction. So if you were to sort of map spatially, like, the themes when there are, if you were doing linguistic pragmatics or something and you wanted to mark where is the topic change in conversation, it would be like, whoop, 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 whoop. It would sort of go on for a little while and then go over here and then go over there and then go over there. But subjectively, it would seem like, oh yeah, let's go over here. Oh yeah, let's go over there. You know what I mean? Okay. And so it's a little bit like a walk. A lit conversation can have the structure of a walk, where the main point is to walk around talking with no destination and no goal other than talking while walking. Okay. Hablando mientras pasando. Okay. Now, you might feel, if you're a conversant in one of these conversations, you might feel when there is one of these switches into a new thread that there was more to say on the previous threads, you just didn't get to them. But the shift to new thread is just as interesting as the now discontinued one, and you might get back to it. Okay. Now, these two conversants who are having this type of conversation, call them A and B, they're not going to have probably exactly the same things in their working memory. But a remark made by B may linger in A's consciousness without lingering in B's, for example. So something might have stuck with you that didn't stick with me, and vice versa. But if A refers back to that thing, B will remember it. So it's sort of like you have this common pool of accessible points or cuentas, palabras, ideas, atmosferas, momentos, and so on, that the conversants can feel they share because it's kind of mutually accessible. See what I mean? Okay, and that's actually a pretty productive way to experience shifting horizons of a neighborhood in the walking case, than just go on a walk without any specific directional agenda. And then a parallel point could apply to what we might call the space, zetetic space, the space of inquiry. This word that people somehow just started using in philosophy. Zetetic. Zetetico, is that how they say it? Zetetico, why not? Okay, so it's sort of like problems have spaces too. Problems have spaces, like practical problems, math problems, other problems. There's dimensions to a problem. You can talk your way through a problem, and you can talk your way through an inquiry, and that's part of what we do when we advise our students. So a wandering conversation can get to a lot of places, just as the Jeremies can make contact with a lot of tasks. So I hope you can see the sort of analogy structurally between this kind of distractible, undisciplined mode of attention and the pattern you can have in a conversation or even in a walk. Now, in a conversation that's the way I've described, the conversants, just by hypothesis, don't feel any need to try and control it or to keep it on a thread from which it may wander when it just flows. And that's when the kids say it's lit, it's en fuego. And the fire, it spreads, it burns, it persists, it warms, it generates, it activates, it cooks, it makes things develop and transform. So, okay, very metaphorically, those are just sort of modes of fiery potential. These are the potential benefits described heavily metaphorically. So I could just stop there, but let's unpack the metaphor, because this isn't a poetry reading. This is a philosophy talk. Okay, so let's just try to unpack en fuego a little bit. All right, so conversations can return to previous threads or topics. They can have what I want to call a dormant mode. Dormant mode. Now, this is confusing in translating it into Spanish, because I don't want you to think dormido. That's going to be something different. Adormilado. Gracias. Okay, good. This is why I didn't get a chance to do it in advance, because these sorts of things I'd be like, Adriana, ¿cómo se dice eso? Okay. And she'd tell me too, right away. Okay, so they can have a dormant mode, meaning they can stay alive at the same time, even if they're not currently occupying attention. See what I'm saying? Okay. And so that's one already, that's just one feature of them. I just want to describe some features of like, what does it mean to say it's en fuego? Because really, I'm not going to rely on that at all. It fixes ideas nicely, I think. Okay, now, given that all of these thematically separate things are simultaneously alive, even if they're not all enfocando, right? They're not all in focus at the exact same moment. That means that they are available to interact. It's very important. So earlier verbalizations, could prompt later associations or insights. There's all sorts of relevance in inquiry. Something that comes up later may bear on a question raised in passing earlier. There's what in the theory of comedy, in English anyway, is called back references. Does anybody know what this is? Okay. So jokes, comparisons, inferences. And then there's feelings of continuity. So highlighting the kind of shared time and mutual attention. You can display your retention of having jointly attended earlier in the conversation. So there's a kind of dynamic form of acknowledgement that's made possible by having all these things simultaneously alive. See what I'm saying? Okay. The other thing that can happen just as a result of this accumulation of simultaneously live threads is that conversants can notice patterns across the other's contributions, whether those patterns are thematized or articulated or not. So for example, there are some people who kind of will tell you 10 stories, but they're all basically the same story. They'll tell you 10 stories and they're all sort of kind of apparently different, but there's this similarity that they're always the hero, or they're always the victim, or they're always lucky, or they're always just beset by practical problems with no solution or something. And that's not a criticism. I'm just saying that you can see these patterns of narrative schema sometimes. And that's really important if you're gonna, you can just notice those things. I'm just saying that if everything that happened in a conversation was just gone afterward, you couldn't do this. You couldn't see those patterns. Okay. All right. Good. So those features, all these features I've listed, these are features enabled by this wandering accumulative quality in the lit conversation. All right. Now, I want to make just two observations about these benefits that I've tried to kind of illustrate just by describing these features of the conversation. One is that, just to kind of position it in another recent paper that discusses conversations, is by Daniela Dover, a wonderful paper called The Conversational Self. And in that paper, she's talking about something sort of similar, but it's actually also very different. So she is emphasizing something way more serious in the lit conversation. You can have a lit conversation with anybody. This doesn't have to be a deep thing of, you might never see them again. It could be small talk on the metro with your taxista. I've had many lit conversations with it. It's just boom, 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 and I learn a lot from these things. But Dover is talking about sort of mutual vulnerability and openness to changing your view of yourself and all this stuff. I'm like, okay, this is easier. The lit conversation is less kind of intense or whatever. It's not, and it might not issue. A lit conversation could result in the kind of getting to know each other that she is interested in that particular paper. But it doesn't have to. This is something way more, it's abstracting from these other, vulnerabilities and so on that she's talking about. And then I want to make another observation, which is that Chandra Tripada, who's written a lot about mind wandering, and I've learned a lot from that, though, as with most of my favorite theorists, I hardly ever agree with them, but, it's good to think with. He characterizes he says that mind wandering promotes insight, which he thinks of as pattern recognition, across a large search space. That's a quote from him. Mind wandering promotes pattern recognition across a large search space. It's a means that he calls exploration as opposed to exploitation. So do you use this exploración, exploitación? Is that how you say it? Okay, good. So that's from computer science and ecology, biology, this distinction, where exploration is like getting new information and exploitation is operating on information you have already. Okay. So Sripada is also, like I am, interested in pointing out potential benefits in modes of attention that might otherwise be dismissed or disparaged as like, oh, you're distractible or something like that. And his way of classifying his way of describing, characterizing what the beneficial thing is that it's like exploration as opposed to exploitation. So I think that's something not quite right about that, because at least in the lit conversation, you could do a lot of both of these things. You could draw a lot of inferences. You can make a lot of progress on your inquiries. It isn't just sort of, okay, let me just accumulate stuff. And I think that partly that's because he isn't thinking about these dialogical cases, Though I think even in the single case of, you don't have two people, you just have one person thinking about this, thinking about that, staring into space, mind wandering. It can still have this. So I don't think that the benefits are really captured very well by exploration as opposed to exploitation. I published a paper recently called Wandering Inquiry, where I try to make this case more for like, just the single person thinking about stuff. Okay. All right. Now, I just want to make a couple of observations about the difference between being wandering and spontaneity, these two concepts. Okay, so if you think about the possibility of asymmetrical, you could have asymmetrical joint mind wandering. How could that happen? Well, you could have a reciprocal symmetrical lit conversation, but you could also have asymmetrical ones where, for example, one person sort of hitches a ride on someone else's spontaneous flow. And in fact, this is what Sigmund Freud recommended as a central therapeutic technique, remember? For Freud, what you're supposed to do is the therapeutic technique is one person sits there and sort of like lets her mind go wherever, follows the fundamental rule, which is just don't stop yourself from saying something, even if it seems irrelevant or inappropriate or whatever. But the other person, the analyst, is like, focusing on this spontaneous thing. And okay, so that's an example of how it could be asymmetrical. Now, spontaneity is a slightly different thing. So I'm just putting this on the table in case it's useful for us. So Jonathan Gingrich has this recent paper called Spontaneous Freedom, Libertad Espontánea. It's a great paper. Now he's interested in experiences of a certain feeling of freedom to do various things. Okay. But in the course of discussing that, which is his topic, he says some useful things about just conceptually what spontaneity is, or what his kind that he's interested in is. And he emphasizes that the spontaneous things are unplanned and unscripted and non-alienated, meaning that they feel like they come from you in some way. Now, spontaneous freedom, the thing he wants to talk about, is characterized in part by its content. The experiences of spontaneous freedom are experiences of openness to what you could be and do and stuff like that. Okay. But spontaneity in the flow of thought is actually characterizable independently of its content. So that's an important difference. But it is, nonetheless, has these features of being unplanned and unscripted. Like you didn't plan to talk about that stuff in the lit conversation. It just came up. Okay. All right. So like the Jeremys, for example, going back to them, they might not have at any moment any sense of like, oh, my broad subjective horizon is open to, they might not have these like very seemingly valuable experiences of spontaneous freedom, but they might enact it, but they might not experience themselves as having it. You see what I'm saying? Like if you were trying to keep track of what Jeremy did that evening, you have a lot of trouble because it keeps changing, like he had to keep updating you of like, I'm over here. No, I'm over here. What are you doing? No, I'm doing this. It's like, what are you doing tonight? You're doing all these different things. See what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So I've given you some examples of spontaneous and wandering thought streams. Good. We have the lit conversation. We have the Jeremys. And now what I want to ask is how can we characterize that type of dynamic mode of attention in more general terms? Okay. So now let's stop talking about examples and start talking about models. Okay. All right. So the first model comes from Sripada again, Taxcali and Sripada, who have this fantastic paper called, Taxcali is a psychiatrist, Structure in the Stream of Consciousness. Okay, and their question is the same as my question. They want to know how is this spontaneous stream of thought structured? And their strategy from answering it is to do this experiment, which is a great experiment. And in this experiment, basically I think of this experiment as sending voice memos. Anybody send voice memos? ¿Cómo se llama eso? You say that. Okay, great. So like, it's simple sometimes. Like you sort of sit there by yourself when you send, well, you know how to send a voice memo. Let me tell you about the experiment. In the experiment, they take the participants, and the participants sit in a dark room for 30 minutes, and their job is to speak into the tape recorder and verbalize their thoughts. And they're given certain instructions, like don't worry about entertaining the, experimenters or anything like that. Just talk. And they do eliminate some people. They did this at the University of Michigan. And one person came in there and maybe they were trying to optimize or something. They just rehearsed their computer science homework. They had a problem set due. So they were like sort of, I don't know, rehearsing their problem set. Or maybe they felt, who knows? I'm not going to try to guess why they did that, but that guy got eliminated. And then somebody else, for 30 minutes, only reported 4 thoughts. So 30 minutes, a long time. And they sort of sat quietly, and then once in a while they'd say something. And they were eliminated with the idea that, they probably didn't really follow the instructions. There must have been something else going on in their mind, besides these 4 thoughts, or so they assumed. So they're eliminated. But they got a lot of other people who blah, 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 blah. My sister, she'll send me these long ones, it'll be like really long. And I myself, no surprise, I'm sure, have no problem sending a super long voice memo. It's basically a podcast. Okay, so that's the data. Okay, then what do they do with the data? What they do with the data is now they have all these transcripts of people saying this stuff, and they give it to a whole number of different coders and working independently, and they tell the coders, mark where there's a shift in, where you think there's a shift in topic. And they all do that, and then there's all this intersubjective agreement among the coders of the structure of this stream of thought. And they call that structure clump and jump. Clump and jump. So this works well in English. Clump and jump. The clumps are like the topically, thematically unified things. And then there's a jump. And the reason they did this is because Taxcali is a psychiatrist. They're interested in people with Parkinson's disease who have supposedly paucity of thoughts, not very much, like the 4-thought guy. And they're interested in ADHD people or manic people who sometimes have, like a gazillion. And so, clinically, it seemed to them, their suspicion was that these 2 extremes are extremes, that they're somehow different from the norm. But of course, they're scientists. You can't just sort of say that. You got to have some data. You need to know, what is the baseline? How jumpy are people? How big, how long are their clumps, and how frequent are their jumps? They wanted a baseline for that. And so they did this experiment. And they thought, well, if we gather people where we're sure, we have some reason to think that they really are delivering us some spontaneous flow of thought, then we can see the structure, we can get a baseline, and then we'll have some way of comparing it to these other, sort of extremely jumpy or extremely clumpy extremes. So that was cool. They could measure the sort of shiftiness of that. So that's all good. And for their purposes, I think that worked pretty well. But it has some limitations. And its limitation is it does not actually tell us what makes something spontaneous or wandering. It doesn't tell us what it makes it that way. And that's fine for their purposes. But if we want to know, for our purposes, how can we characterize the Jeremys and the lit conversation more general terms? This is not actually going to help us to know that it's clump and jump. And also just think about other things it can't describe, like all clump and jump sees is discontinuity between adjacent clumps. And so for all clump and jump says, you could have topic 1, topic 2, topic 1, topic 2, topic 1, topic 2, topic 1, topic 2, topic 1, topic 3, topic 1, topic 4. You see what I'm saying? It is a poetry reading. Just kidding. Okay, so it's blind to continuities across clumps. You can't model that in their model. All right, so we can't really describe the things we want to describe because some of the benefits come exactly from not being, from the diversity of the topics. Some of the benefits come from that. Some of the benefits come from being able to loop back and find continuity across clumps. You can't model that in their thing. All right, good. So their central analytic tool is sort of discontinuity. And that's, if you think about it, it's a feature of relationships among contents of these thoughts. Whereas to characterize wandering spontaneity in a flow of thought, we need to characterize transitions in a way that sees more than just relationships between the contents. We need something that's structural and abstracts from that. So that brings us to Zach Irving's model. So here's a way to characterize, here's something true of the Jeremys, which is that nothing internal to the Jeremys, no effort, no will, nothing else, disciplines or regulates or forces their attention back to whatever it shifted away from, right? That's why they can so easily move from one thing to another. So we could say they lack any internal source of anti-interruptive pressure on attention, anti-interruptive pressure on attention. They lack that. I realize this is a mouthful. But it's better than talking about distractibility, which emphasizes only what you shift away from, and then tries to characterize it all negatively. And in fact, there's a big conceptual problem with relying too heavily on the concept of distraction, because as activated Jeremy shows us, one and the same attention shift can be distraction from one thing, but engagement with another. So that was the sort of point of the first section. Okay, so you could say this is Irving's idea put into different vocabulary. His vocabulary is that mind wandering is unguided attention. I won't pause to explain why he uses that vocabulary. It's much simpler, but I don't think it really, it's simpler, and I'm not changing his idea at all. I'm just putting it in different terms that you'll see in a moment why we need these other terms. Okay, so a wandering thought stream is a sequence of these thoughts that lacks anti-interruptive pressure on attention, meaning there is nothing internal to the thought stream that pressures you to kind of go back to one, after you've switched away from it. Okay. Now, two kinds of thoughts. So Irving is talking about mind wandering. The thing that's wandering is the mind. This thing, the mind. But I think it's better to talk about wandering streams in the mind, because that allows us to capture cases where you could have more than one, two channels within a stream of thought where one of them is wandering and one of them is not. And maybe this happens to you sometimes if you are running, and you're also thinking. You're running and you're thinking. You have like the running strand, and that's like very task and goal oriented, and you're sort of monitoring your form or whatever you do when you run. And then it's relaxing. I mean, you're not sprinting. If you're sprinting, you're not thinking about anything else, but maybe you're not sprinting. So you have one stream that has one dynamic character, and you have another stream with another, and you can't capture that if you talk about mind wandering. If the thing that can wander or not is the mind, it's too big. See what I'm saying? We need more differentiation. All right. I was going to give you an example of this, but I'm going to skip my example. We're going to skip over the swimmer thing, so I'm going to skip to page 9. I just want to, because I think you get the point about, and I'll go with the example if you want me to later, but if you have examples where you have like two channels within the mind and one of them is wandering, the other one is not, and then you ask, is this person's mind wandering? It would seem like if you try to force someone to answer this question, you don't know whether it's like, well, yes, because they have a wandering stream, or no, because they have a non-wandering stream. It just seems silly to try to force an answer. You can keep the key observation, the key, really innovation from Irving, that, this nice way of characterizing what a wandering stream is. It's just you apply it to a more specific differentiate. All right. Now, I said that there were pitfalls as well as benefits. So let me just mention a couple of these things. So sometimes a stream lingers longer than we really want it to. So have you ever had somebody come home grumpy, and take it out on you? That's when like a grumpy inducing thing happened. And now now it's not just that they're grumpy, so they're snapping at you. It's that you are appearing to them as deserving it. Okay, so I wrote a book about cognitive penetrability because I was very interested in that phenomenon, or phenomenon of that shape. Okay, so that's a pitfall. You have this thing that's still alive in your mind, and then it's interacting with the other things. It's the same structure. It's just now, instead of being like, oh, and you can, get all these things done, it's like, no, could you please leave that other channel, shut it down, put it in sleeper mode, don't let it interact with all these other things. Sometimes we know from human life that's very, very, very difficult. So that's a pitfall of this too. Okay. Okay, I'll leave it there. Now, I just want to give you, I think, can I go a little bit longer?
Well, not on time, but
all right.
10 minutes more.
Oh God, I'm not going to go 10 minutes more. I'm going to go 5 minutes more. Or that's what I think I'm going to do. All right. So I just want to give you one last illustration from this story by Lydia Davis, who's an American fiction writer. And she has a story, which if you have the document that was distributed, it's at the end. It's a great story, really short, really short. I'll just read you the opening of the story because I want to use it to illustrate this distinction between the chronological flow, that's everything, and the channels within it. Okay. That distinction I just mentioned is the one that helps us, characterize wandering thought streams more exactly, characterize the overall, dynamics of attention in someone's mind more exactly. Okay, so here is, the story is called Foucault and Pencil. Sí, se trata de Michel Foucault. Okay, sat down to read Foucault with pencil in hand. Knocked over a glass of water onto waiting room floor. Put down Foucault and pencil, mopped up water, refilled glass. Sat down to read Foucault with pencil in hand. Stopped to write a notebook. Took up Foucault with pencil in hand. Counselor beckoned from doorway. Put away Foucault and pencil as well as notebook and pen. That's just the beginning. You have the whole story at the end of the handout. Okay, so the chronological flow embeds all of these unrelated episodes, the spilling of the water, the writing in the notebook, the reading of the book. Now, this is a story. It doesn't exhaustively reflect anyone's chronological flow, and perhaps you couldn't do that. Just as the clump and jump experiment that Taxcali and Sripada did, it's not purporting to be a kind of window into everything in this person's mind, because of course it's not. It's only what they verbalize. It's not about like the feeling of their feet in their shoes. It's not about all this background stuff. It's not about their purple imagery, unless they choose to verbalize that. But then you have an additional thing than the thing that was verbalized. So it's like all this, and they know that. They're saying they don't care about that, or they think that doesn't matter. Okay, and similarly here, it's not like you can sort of very easily, as every consciousness researcher, this is the difficulty of researching consciousness. It's not like you can just somehow peek in and see what all's going on in your chronological flow. But this example, this story, I think really nicely highlights just the difference and the relationship between these two kinds of thought streams, the kind of encompassing one and the specific ones within it. The narrative is like sort of giving us a feel for the encompassing one. And then there is the Foucault and pencil motif, this activity. It's that in this example, an activity. That's a kind of stream that's going into what I call dormant mode when she's got to mop up the water. And Husserl had a word for this, retention, remember? It's like you still feel like you're like, no, I'm reading Foucault and pencil. I'm experiencing the mopping up of the water as a distraction that I have to take care of so I can go back to my book. Okay. And this motif, Foucault and pencil motif in the story, allows us to re-identify that activity that she enters and exits within the chronological flow of thought. Okay, so she's holding the pencil. Why is she holding a pencil? Because it's hard book to understand, and it helps her, the narrator, feel ready to read Foucault. But that readiness doesn't always culminate in continuation. So here's the rest. Here's how the story goes on. Sat with counselor discussing situation fraught with conflict, taking form of many heated arguments. Counselor pointed to danger, raised red flag. Left counselor went to subway, sat in subway car, took out Foucault and pencil, but did not read. Thought instead about situation fraught with conflict. After several stations on subway, thinking about argument, stopped thinking and opened Foucault. Found Foucault in French, hard to understand. Okay, so what's happening when you're reading is you're subjecting yourself. We subject ourselves to the words on the page. We allow them to become perceptually salient to us. So the book like hands us some sentences and we process them. And so in her like Foucault and pencil channel, Davis's narrator is trying to figure out what's in the book. And then along the way, she notices something, when she's not thinking about the argument, she notices something about what makes it hard to understand. This is just the last thing I want to read because it's another example of a potential benefit of these things. Harder to understand when subject of sentence was noun, like thought, absence, law. Easier to understand when the subject was noun like beach, wave, sand, sanatorium, pension, door, hallway, or civil servant. So look, she's reading to find out what's in the book. What is he saying? What is he doing in this book? But reading prompts this other question that she didn't have at the beginning, which is, why is this sentence hard to understand? So she's not initially treating the question of why, the why is it hard to understand questions as somehow sub-questions in her inquiry of like, what's Foucault doing in this book? But having raised both questions, she gets into a position to regard one answer as informing how to answer another. See what I'm saying? So this is a case of like wandering inquiry doing something good. You accumulate this stuff. Maybe the easier to understand sentences clarify what the book is doing. Like, the book, rethinking the nature of power, seeing how it can adhere in everyday practices and stuff. All right. So my conclusions are that wandering thought streams are one way for attention to be undisciplined by executive control. And they can have these accumulative benefits, but also pitfalls. And then there you have the story as a bonus. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Tenemos entonces 10 minutos máximo y regresamos para la parte esta. Pero digo que venga de la mano. Y lo que puedo hacer es, bueno, es una visual, pero es la información y también no sé si es fácil, es que yo no soy creo que nos tiene entonces, te mando la carta y Axel, sí, claro. Preguntas, claro. Pues, hasta la duda ofende. Acabo de llegar, Bueno, pues si quieres empezar, ¿no?
Muchas gracias. Thank you for the talk. It was very stimulating. I wanted to ask about, based on this idea of streams of thought or mind, how would you make sense of different levels of stream that one has with oneself, and sometimes one still divided even between different voices, or let's say, I'm thinking of what I should do, and then I think of I shouldn't be thinking about what I should do, but I've been thinking about being in the present, and then I breathe again, like it's breathing finally, and then I should stop moving my foot because that means I'm never someone saying that I have, and it's like, oh, okay, back to the present, but back to the other thing. So these different paths that feel like one self, and at the same time multiple selves, kind of like riding each of those particular streams.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of that? I would be very interested in how do you try to come up with a model that explains that, not only in terms of neuroscience, or which would be also interesting, but also just in terms of the mind structuring model.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a version of what I call anchorless journey. That's a version of anchorless journey. So if all we know about someone's chronological flow of thought is that it has all of these, quickly truncated streams, sort of like a sequence of internal distractions or truncations of what we begin, inability to focus. And then we don't know whether that's the kind of activated time. We don't know anything about the content of those streams. So when I'm speaking about the structure of attention in this dynamic mode of attention, where you don't have any felt pressure to continue what you begin, and you don't have any felt pressure either from your executive system, your attention, or from what they call salience. It doesn't just sort of happen on its own. We don't know anything else. We don't know anything about the emotional surround. We don't know anything about the content. We don't know anything about why it's like that. But one way for it to be, one reason that one scenario in which it could have that structure is anchorless journey. You can't really settle on anything. It's like that because of some sort of anxiety or whatever it is, that makes it impossible to just sort of stick with one thing for very long to get any momentum or something. So I would describe that in these terms as like the chronological flow has all of these, has a sequence of thematically unified things that are then, cut off, and one moves on to the next one. But it's not just that. I mean, they're cut off in the sense of if you like the clumps in quantum jump, there is something right about quantum jump, which there are these, if you think about the analog of like conversational relevance or something, we do find those things, like in the way you described it. okay, I'm gonna sit down and do this, and now I'm sort of getting self-conscious about this thing, now I'm getting self-conscious about that thing, now I'm feeling bad that I got self-conscious, now I'm going back to, so in a certain sense, all of these things are, shifts from one thought to another. That's forming the chronological flow, if you like to map out the sequence or something, if you were to verbalize it in one of these Pascal's or other experiments, people would make the clumps, where they make it, where you made them. And that's a way of describing the structure of the chronological flow,
Yeah. So maybe what I'm thinking is when one makes music in the computer, you have different streams of beats and rhythm and so on. But for the song to work, there has to be this stream of me out of the computer saying like, oh, I'm gonna run all the streams at the same time.
Right.
So if you think for it to be attention in one single stream, there has to be an extra path or a someone of someone writing the other streams, or they can just go without going from one to another without someone else from outside.
That's what
pulling on the flow.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, in your example, it doesn't contain anything. Can I write on the board?
Yes.
Or maybe I can't write on the board. No, I don't have to write on the board. No, look, I have to do it. I'll write here, you can see it. It's very, I want to write very simple voice. Okay, so aquí hay el chronological flow. Pedro, es the same thing. Oh, great. All right. Let's make sure I don't mess with this thing. Okay, so in an ejemplo, you have a chronological flow, we don't know everything that's happening. But there's one thing, and then there's another thing, and there's another thing. These are somehow distinct. So we number them as distinct, each one from the previous one. Okay. Now, so this is just a chronological flow with these truncated things. The chronological flow is the space in which this happened. And other things happen too, like maybe the whole time your foot is uncomfortable. So that's another. Now, so this is, we'll call this number 4. Now, maybe what happens is you really want to go back to 1, and maybe you do go back to 1. So here's 1 again. Now, so far, we don't know anything about whether this channel within the stream is somehow still alive during this period. This is time. We don't know whether it's alive in that period or something, but it might be. The chronological flow is just the sort of space in which nobody's driving it or anything. So what I didn't have a chance to really explain is what is it to be executively controlled. But the crucial thing maybe that was missing, that maybe this helps, is that executive control is just one type of force that could determine how long is this pump, or what's the next one after that, or what happens when there's a shift. So that's just one type of force that could determine that in the mind. Then there's other types of force, like when you're ruminating. That's what they call, and Zach are going to have great discussions of this. That's what they call something affective salience. So you're if one, the case where it's like you keep on doing something, but you keep coming back to 1. Maybe 1 is like thought instead about argument, fraught with conflict. Sat down to read for cold with a pencil. Filled the water. Thought about the conflict. Sat down to read for cold with a pencil. Thought about the conflict. This thing is kind of intruding, and not because of executive control, but because it's affectively salient. It's exerting pressure on your attention from within, from the salient. Like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's okay.
Gracias, Pedro. Thank you so much, Susanna. I think this is extremely rich and interesting, but I was wondering whether in the dynamic mode of undisciplined mode of attention would be room for, in particular, I wonder whether spontaneous thought, how to say, spontaneous wandering, spontaneous thought streams would be possible to make room for self-triggered those indisciplined spontaneous thoughts.
Right.
So just rather than being, just raised or induced by certain stimuli, I was just thinking whether it would be possible, yes, to account for self-trigger them just for the purpose, for example, of being more creative. So sometimes we have to switch off our attention, and if there would be room for your account on those for another move, let's say.
Yeah, thank you. So this is what happens sometimes in a brainstorming session. So we get together to brainstorm, and there's some sort of we get together, we make a decision, we have purposeful brainstorm. But when we are brainstorming, we're not there to sort of evaluate every idea. We just want to generate the ideas. But if somebody barges into the room and sort of gets the wrong room and they are trying to look for some other thing, we tell them, send them on their way, and then we go back to brainstorm. So what I think that shows is that there's a sort of the sequence is more than, there's the sequence of thoughts in a stream, and then there's the stream as a whole. And these are actually different things. At the level of the whole stream, it is regulated by executive control because we decided to have a brainstorming session. So there is the session, and then there's a sequence of things within the session. And the sequence of things has one status, and the stream as a whole, has a different status. And the same thing can be true, you can use to account for these seeming puzzles that Irving discusses. The puzzle of the purposeful mind wanderer, So how many people are like, I just want to go get my mind into a certain state? Okay, now of course, it takes some care to make sure it works, because if it's too orchestrated and stilted, you'll get in your own way in the same way that, in the skilled action cases, if you pay attention to what you're doing, you screw yourself. But there too, we can make use of this difference between, the channel as a whole and the sequence of things in it. So this is another distinction that I think Irving sort of needs to make this point, and can have to make this point. Because the thing as a whole is executively controlled or metacognitively, but the elements of it are not. None of the elements of it are regulated against everyone. So thank you.
No, thank you. If there's a chance for a follow-up, I will.
Okay. Would you like to say something else?
Just this is super interesting. Yes, but I was just thinking when sometimes we would like to be creative, or do other things to avoid being bored. I was thinking whether your account could give an answer to that path, going in that direction of finding creativity and looking for creativity from undisciplined.
Looking for it. So is that when you say looking? So creativity, there's a whole lot of different ways of theorizing it, and maybe the answer to this question might depend on how we, how we theorize it. But how are you thinking of it? Are you thinking that there's a sort of the onset of a specific type of stream could be executively controlled, but then what happens after that, could be a different thing. As this is kind of what happens when you go to sleep. It's like I want to go to sleep, and then you fall asleep.
Just trying to change the direction.
Wait. So I see. In the midst of it, it's like a lucid dream sort of. Except the waking version. Yeah. I mean, there are going to be these mixed streams. So it's not that I think the only kinds of, I have it. It is very in later parts of this project. I try to do a lot more taxonomizing of how many different kinds of streams are there here, which is sort of important if you want to ask normative questions about them. Of which are what sort of. How could you make it a target for norms of attention if you even sensibly could? You need some sense of what are these different types of dynamic modes of attention and how might they interact. So, yeah.
So,
Thanks a lot. So I wanted to ask you about the scope of the project, this part in particular, and the other one in general. So that I was hearing two possible readings of the kind of suggestions that you were making. One is that more descriptive. So look, we have these features, and given that we have that, these can result in these this and that positive thing. But there is also a further reading which says, no, the reason why we mind read, so it's more normative. So the proper function of mind wandering is allowing us to do things like synthetic space exploration, etc., etc. And I wasn't able to distinguish these two examples, so I can have a feature here, and I just use it for that, given that I have it. But those appear, so there is no reason to state it. Whereas in this case, maybe in some cases, it seems suggestive that the reason why we mind wander, it serves a purpose, and in that case, it would be something like a proper function. So I would like to hear a little bit more, because I would expect something like more systematic. And indeed, I think that our mind wandering is sometimes systematic. It's not just a random. So I was thinking like, these Roomba robots, they start to recover, and there are different algorithms. And some of them might seem, from the point of view of the executive system, like random, but they are not totally random. And it seems that our mind wandering is not completely random. So can you please guide me to this very question? So
thank you so much. Okay, so in the literature on mind wandering from Moshe Bar and various neuroscientists and some philosophers, there is a lot of, there's a fair bit of kind of debate or differences in how they're wielding that concept. So Moshe Bar, for example, who has a book called Mind Wandering, he, in the book, though not always in his papers, he treats it as basically synonymous with whatever happens when the default mode is gone. So if you just sort of sit there, whatever comes to mind, that's mind wandering. Now, if you think of it like that, then you can use the term that way if you want to. That's not how Irving thinks about it, because that doesn't have this business about lacking anti-interruptive pressure. But if you think of it in the Moshe Bar way, then I don't think it has a proper function. If you want to speak that broadly, why? Because if you just sit down and see what comes to mind, or sit down and verbalize into the, which is what Taxpeli and Sripada are hoping to capture in their paradigm, you might get salience, you might get obsessive rumination, you might get that, or you might get, making plans for, tomorrow, or you might be simulating what's going to happen next, or replaying what happened earlier, something that Bar emphasizes. And you might do that for purposes, as part of a task. So you might, end up thinking about your exam that you have tomorrow, in which case it's like not random, or it might be random, might not be random. You just don't know if all you know, if you define it as, he's a brain scientist, so of course he defines it in like brain terms. If you define it in brain terms, like, no surprise, it's like the brain does its thing, and then cognitively it's like 10, many, many different things happen if you define it that way. So defined that way, I don't think it has a proper function. Though you can understand, and I like the way Bar talks about why it would make sense to do these things. You simulate as a way of, processing things that happened or preparing and so on. And if you think of, here's another axis along which people try to define mind wandering. So first axis, you define it just as what the brain does. Second axis, do you define it in terms of content or distractibility? So Smallwood and Schooler, who were the sort of original, scientists studying this, they defined it as task unrelated thought. So when you hear these statistics of people spend like half your life, you spend mind wandering, your wake life. So it's like probably some reason why we do it. But if you characterize, if you operationalize, try to mind wandering as task unrelated thought, what you're doing is you're defining it now not in terms of any brain thing, but in terms of content. And this has all sorts of conceptual problems because you're presuming that there's a task, and then the mind wandering is somehow not on the task. But you might have several tasks, like the fact that what am I thinking about when I'm staring into space, like you implicated in your question, is some things of like, how am I going to get there tomorrow? That's also a task. So it's like, I don't think it will work. And I think this is Irving, I owe the point to Irving, I don't think it will work. I think he just showed this, in other words, to define mind wandering in content terms. And that's why I'm reaching for these structural terms that abstract from content, which is why we have all these different terms and so on, which is why you have no idea what kind of mood or situation Jeremy is in. And all you know about him is that he's just, moving distractible, that's the shorthand of moving from one thing to another. So yeah, if you define it in terms of content, it's just conceptually problematic. So I don't think you should even define it that way. But you see what I'm saying is that if when people did define it that way and they try to talk about proper functions, they end up saying things like, bar, does of like, well, it's not really random, but then sometimes it is random. And so if all those things are mind wandering, he doesn't have a problem. Okay, if you define it Irving's way, as like in the structural terms, it's not in trying to get beyond like task unrelated thought, then does it have a proper function? That's a good question. I don't think, does it have a proper function? I'm not sure how to think about that. I'm very interested in what happens if you try to take mind wandering and make it a target for norms of attention. Like, is it good, is it bad, or, should we balance it? Is there, with other things, like that. I kind of think in the end, they're just psychological categories that don't have I don't know, I have to just please hold on the proper function question. I suspect it doesn't have a proper function. But as for whether it's sort of better or worse, I kind of suspect there's not really a good answer to that question. Any more than, I think it just sort of depends on what happens within it. I think it depends on, I tried to highlight some things that are, seem sort of valuable, some other things that seem maybe a little less valuable. But that means that those evaluations are targeting things that happen in mind wandering. They're not targeting mind wandering per se. So maybe I read something into your question because you asked about proper function, but I answered you about other normative things.
That's what exactly the normative. Can I just say something?
Yeah.
So that's exactly the point where I wanted to go. So one way of doing that would be, for example, in terms of whether it's good for attention, it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
That's totally fine. But for example, finding some kind of systematicity might be also an indication of proper function, because there is something.
Mm-hmm.
So the structure itself is a structure with some aim. I'm reading some teleology there, or good, bad, and all these ways of putting the question would be like go from one way to another. In this case, systematicity or good or bad for attention, these kind of things.
I see. So there's sort of two issues here, two normative things. So there's one normative thing, which is it good for the person? Is it good for human life? Is it like humanly valuable, and should be therefore, try to make happen? Or, of course, that's a good thing. Then there's another question, is it good as mind wandering? Like, this is a good cup, like, is it good as mind wandering? It's just different from like, should I do it? Or, is it good for life? So what would be like, this is very poor mind wandering. I don't really see what's added, by talking to that way. I don't see what's added to just saying it isn't mind wandering. Once the structure stops being, once the structure starts to be regulated against interruption, then, to that extent, you're just not mind wandering. So what's added to the idea of like, I stopped mind wandering because I fell into this other structure, as opposed to like, this is very bad mind wandering. Like, all right, if you were trying to mind wander, the sad fact would be that you're now not doing it. But, I don't know if that makes it bad as mind wandering as opposed to just not mind wandering. Susan.
So, thank you very much. So I had a question that kind of similar to Adriana's and some of the stuff you were just talking about as well, about maybe a more intentional, purposeful analog of mind wandering. And in particular, I was thinking about the case at the beginning of Jeremy, where he switches from one task to another, to another task, to another task. And it made me think of what I would call structured procrastination.
Right.
Where, I've got this big task I don't want to do. And so in order not to do that big task, I do a lot of other little tasks I also needed to do, which it's useful that I did them. And maybe even kind of which task gets categorized in my mind as the big scary one that I don't want to do changes as I go along. And so I make a little bit of progress on all the different tasks and I actually have quite a productive day. And I think there's been some philosophical work on the structure of procrastination. So I think John Perry had something I'm not too aware of. So I was kind of wondering whether the benefits and pitfalls that people have spoken about in relation to structured procrastination might be useful to you, but you think that they might carry across to your life.
Well, I think of those as structured procrastination. I think of that as just not mind wandering, and that it's these are all like executive structured things. So so I don't think of these dynamic modes capture everything we need when we talk about distraction.
Sure.
But distraction is like I don't like I'm against relying on that concept to characterize the thing that we set out. I'm not doing the big scary thing. I'm procrastinating. There's also procrastinating, there's all kinds of things you can do instead that are kind of, you described it perfectly. But I don't think of any of those things as wandering. I see what you're saying. You're sort of like wandering away from the big task. You're not really wandering. You're just sort of doing another thing instead. Yeah, and that thing has its own structure, which is exactly like.
Well, I sort of wonder the benefits or the pitfalls might carry across, even if they are, as you say,
Oh, I see.
different things.
I see. Maybe. Yeah, and I mean, it could be that you do a whole bunch of little things and then you notice relationships between them or something like that. That could absolutely happen. So yeah.
Well, it's going to be a very similar point, so maybe you will give the same sort of answer. But I wasn't thinking about procrastination, but also about boredom, because a lot of what has been discussed around boredom reminds me a lot of what the kind of things you say about what I thought about distraction, but now I realize that it was actually not distraction, right? That if you read well, in the literature on boredom, when people talk about the advantages, they say a lot of the things, like the things you say,
Right.
that allows you to like incorporate new ideas that maybe you don't have an actual task that makes you focus on them, but now but because you're bored, you're gonna pick them up and then.
Right.
So there seems to be enough of a parallelism that maybe they're not just analogous, but actually kind of different aspects of the same phenomenon of not having your attention being tightly linked to a given task.
Yeah, thank you. I think boredom is a cross-cutting category. So you can be bored when you're mind wandering or not. You could be bored when you're executively directed, as we all know, or not. You could be bored really in any of these modes. So I think that it cuts across those things. So boredom per se it's like it has a contingent relationship with these advantages or benefits, just as mind wandering does.
So when you are boringly mind wandering, so you think that you are bored despite being mind wandering, or you are mind wandering because you're bored?
I think that mind wandering, characterized structurally, is not characterized in terms of content. And boredom is something about perhaps the relationship to a content. And so that's why you can be bored, you could be bored and mind wandering. And that's due to, if you ask, well, why is this boring? It's like, because I'm thinking about boring things. That's why. It's not because I'm not regulated against interruption. That's just a structural feature that doesn't see anything about it.
I have to.
Andrés.
Sí, voy a preguntar en español, ¿está bien?
Sí, por favor.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Perdón. Quería preguntar, porque no sé si, no lo vi presente en tu presentación, entonces no sé si fue que me distraje o no estaba. Quería preguntar para poder determinar si el mind wandering tiene beneficios o no, no sería oportuno dirigir la atención hacia el tipo de tareas o tipo de prácticas que estamos llevando a cabo. Porque digamos, si voy a salir a tomar con mis amigos a un bar, tal vez ahí el mind wandering fue chido, ¿no? Inclusive si es distinto, si no estamos dispuestos a divagar en la conversación y eso, de hecho parece ser como contraproducente para la práctica que estamos haciendo. Pero me imagino que hay prácticas donde precisamente el mind wandering puede ser problemático, inclusive peligroso, no sé. Alguien que está manejando un cohete a la luna, ¿no?
Sí.
O casos un poco menos extremos, digamos, el juez en un caso penal, ¿no? Donde deja poner atención a los testigos, y no sé si de pronto eso puede abrir la puerta, por ejemplo, a que se activen, o sea, el mind wandering, que se activen, digamos, ciertos sesgos cognitivos e implícitos. Por ponerse a pensar en otras cosas lleva a que se le active un sesgo racista o misógino, y pues eso termina afectando el proceso. Entonces, sí, o sea, creo que para evaluar eso, si es beneficioso o no, sería importante mirar el tipo de prácticas que estamos llevando a cabo y tal vez por ahí pueda echar luces sobre el mind wandering. Pero no sé qué piensas, qué preguntas sobre eso.
Okay. A ver si, okay, so I'm going to answer.
Sí,
Okay, so, bueno, a veces mind wandering es peligroso. Y es la pregunta, ¿cuál es la relación entre el mind-wandering que es peligro y los beneficios que es la question?
Ya, ya.
Correct. Yeah, la relación es, okay, sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes it's dangerous because, en tu ejemplo de manejar, it's dangerous because you are, of what you're distracted from. Now, if all we know is that you are distracted from driving, we don't yet know whether you're mindful. What? Oh, sorry. Yeah. We don't yet know that, at least on the analysis I'm focused on here. And the reason we don't know that is because we don't know how the person is disposed to respond to the interruption. So if you're disposed to respond to the interruption by pulling yourself back, then I mean, it's still dangerous. But if you're not disposed to pull yourself back from that, if you didn't even realize that was happening, then we're mind-wandering. So but both of them are dangerous, is my point. So the first observation is that what's dangerous in that example is distraction per se. But that's something broader than distraction from driving. Distracted driving is not per se mind-wandering. That's the point.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I think the streams thing, the thing about multiple channels helps us here too, because you have a driving channel, but because it's a very habitual action, it can be so habitual that it's not exerting very much pressure on your attention. So you have to put your attention on it. And yeah, and it can be dangerous to have these, you want the stream, you don't want the driving stream to become a mind-wandering stream. The driving stream has to be regulated against interruptions from whatever minimal amount of attention you need to pay in order to drive properly. So yeah, it's not inherently beneficial. It's a psychological category. Whether it's beneficial or disadvantageous, very much depends on the content of what you're doing. Those are content things. This is a structural.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. And it's about emotions.
Yeah.
You didn't talk about emotions.
I did talk about emotions.
Did you?
I talked about affective salience, like when you're
Yeah,
assessing.
because it seems to me obviously that our emotions change the wandering of our thought. When I'm angry, I repeat always the same thing against somebody or something like that. And when I'm happy, I mean, I don't know which direction I go. I mean,
Yeah.
more multi-task happiness.
Yeah. There's a debate about this actually. Moshe Bar thinks that positive mood makes the associate, because he thinks all in terms of Hebbian links and associations. He thinks it makes you susceptible to broader associations, so that in his vocabulary, it promotes mind wandering. Whereas Irving thinks that, and has experiments supposedly to show us that positive affect makes your mind go back to the thing. And so that would be a mode of regulating against interruption to get people back to that. So, it's a little bit of apples and oranges because they're not meaning exactly the same thing from mind wandering. But I think that, these structural things don't really map. I think there are a lot of different ways to be. I suspect that, well, actually, maybe that's not true. Maybe anger is sort of, some kinds of anger can be, ruminative. But we probably have to distinguish between these episodic emotions and these underlying emotions, because people can stay angry for years. So now we're not, and when that happens, it's probably not that's showing up at every moment in their chronological flow of thought necessarily. So anger is a sort of the conscious manifestation of anger. How does anger occupy your attention? That's a great question. I kind of suspect that there are different ways for it to occupy your attention, but we can't probably map, attention occupying anger onto, any of these psychological categories that I'm describing, but I haven't thought about it.
Okay. Oh, so this-
Thanks. So I want to understand better the model, the structural model
Yeah,
that is get rid of contents. So I try to ask in a way which is kind of objection, but all I'm trying to do honestly is to figure out the model. And I might be completely misunderstood how it's supposed to work. So the idea, if I get it right, is to individuate, to try to characterize this wandering in structural terms as a switches between these different streams. Now, the problem in that case is that it seems to me that there are cases that would fulfill this description that intuitively, for me, are not cases of mind wandering. And I don't know whether that's a problem or you just accommodate that that's my mind wandering, then everything's fine. Like, for example, emotions. So I might have all sort of bottom-up mechanisms that do not go through the executive system that produce a switching from one stream to another. And not all of them seem to be for me cases of mind, of what I intuitively understand as mind wandering. Now it seems without something like some content component or something like that, how would you deal with those cases? It's clear what I have in mind. Can you please help me to get a better picture of it?
There are two aspects of mind wandering that Irving anyway often discusses together, but I think they should be separate. So one is what you were describing as just having disparate topics. Okay, but that's not, I don't think, sufficient for mind wandering for the same reason that pump and jump isn't a good model. Because disparate topics, I mean, herd is just disparate adjacent topics, you know, I mentioned. Herd is just a whole bunch of topics. It's like, what if I'm studying really hard for 5 exams? You know, and it's like, oh, you know, that's not mind wandering at all. So I thought of it as just sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you know, in a short of topics, right? That's absolutely not sufficient. The other strand, which I think is really the core of this theory, it doesn't actually have to have this. And what it has to have is it has to have lack of regulation against interruption. So it's a dispositional thing. Meaning that given what your attention starts on, if a distraction comes up, you are not disposed to return to the initial thing. Okay, now I think this is why I don't really like the term. I mean, there's mind wandering. I think it's just a family of things. So let me give you an aesthetic experience example where I think we can have this second strand of Irving without disparate topics. So if you are engrossed by an artwork or even a tree, you might be focused on the tree, but just pulled in by first one feature and then another feature and then another feature and then another feature, because these are amazing, especially around here. You know? So there, it's not, at least at the level, there's some level of granularity at which it actually isn't disparate topics. It's sort of like, but it is regulation. There is no regulation against interruption. It's like, wait a minute, I want to go back and look at the leaves. It's like, the leaves, the trunk, you know, the shape, you know, the shade, the age, the bark, you know, it's just a very rudimentary aesthetic experience. But you see what I'm saying? Like, there's no regulation against interruption, but it is wandering. It's like, I'm noticing one thing, I'm noticing another thing. I have no felt pressure to go back to the other thing. If somebody comes and says, you know, yanks on my elbow, it's like, it's time to go away from the tree. For it to be an aesthetic experience, it doesn't really matter whether I am like, no, I want to keep looking at it. In which case, now we have one of those cases Adriana asked about, which is like, all right, at the level of looking at the higher level of granularity, looking at the tree doesn't seem like much like mind wandering, but maybe in the, you know, in the sequence it is. And if I'm like, okay, you know, off we go, then it does look a little bit more like mind wandering because it's not regulated against interruption, even at the level of the overall focus. Seems that.
Oh, but then, so that connects with one question that was here at the very beginning. So depend on how we consider the time window, different behaviors might be described as wandering or not. So probably if I consider my whole life,
Right.
very much like Jeremy. I mean, I don't know, you know, it's like now this, then that.
Right.
Right.
despite the fact that I never, I'm very focused and I never.
Right, you are. I know you are.
So
Yeah.
so it seems that the characterization, I'm just pressed to get something out of content.
Completely fair, completely fair. I don't think it's really about the timing though. I think it's about something else, what Adriana raised. I think it's about the difference, which is sort of bastante so, between like the whole stream, the stream as a whole and the elements of the sequence. You might have thought those are the same thing, but I think they're not the same. And the brainstorming example shows that, and the tree example can show that too. It's just that sometimes sometimes it's wandering at the level of the whole and at the level of the sequence, and sometimes, as in Adriana's examples, it isn't. And so a version of the tree case, it could be wandering because it's neither regulated against interruption at the level of the sequences, nor is it regulated at the level of the whole.
I want to know more about the way in which you are thinking about these different channels.
Yes, please.
So one option is they are dealing with different stuff. We have an episodic channel, we have this social channel. They are kind of competing for attention in some kind of way, or they are both, or them in general in a certain way, or we can distinguish between them in terms of time scales. One of them is dealing with longer time scales, other ones are dealing with shorter time scales, or they are all channels dealing with the same kind of stuff.
Yeah. So here is a different sort of methodologies for this. So if you approach the question of what are the channels as just sort of somehow an ontologist who wants to be able to look into someone's mind and find where the channels are, or wants some sort of general criterion for what makes something a channel, I don't really know how to give a theory. I don't know how to develop a model that does that in any satisfying way. There's all sorts of questions that may have occurred to you and people like to say, that make any sense of, or very just in any number of individuation questions. But if you think of it as a phenomenologist, it's a little bit different because, that's why I keep coming back to all these different examples, some of which I didn't have time to go through, but it doesn't matter. You can see in the Olivia Davis story that some channels are unified by activities. Some are unified by moods or emotions that are kind of, affective hangovers or whatever from the previous thing. But they're still they're still occupying some part of your attention. Sometimes we can talk about channels not being in the chronological flow because they sort of went to sleep. So, in the Davis story, when she's thinking about the fight, you could easily picture that, the Foucault's like she forgot all about Foucault. It wasn't like, whereas when she spilled the water, she didn't forget all about Foucault. She was like, oh man, I want to keep reading. It was like it was retained in Husserl's sense. And this is what I think Husserl's concept is really for, is to capture exactly that difference. You remember, it's not that she doesn't remember reading Foucault or she doesn't somehow store the information in her suitcase, longer term memory that this was something she was doing. But it's not sort of alive in her mind, it's not retained, Husserl's term. So now how do you individuate them? Well, there's the activities, sometimes I think there are a whole bunch of different useful ways to think about what individuates them. It's just a sort of motley collection, really. Does that help?
Bueno, pues, una última pregunta, si
Gracias. Thank you very much. This is not going to be that much of a technical question like many of the others. This is more of a curiosity. I've been wondering about the relationship between memory and attention, and also about forgetfulness and memory wandering. Because sometimes I remember things after having some experience that I had never had before.
Yeah.
So I'm reading some text for the first time and it reminds me of something. There's other cases of memory in which I remember something because sort of in the past, they took some decisions that later in the future made me remember that.
Right.
I put some things over here, over there, and then I completely forgot of them.
Yeah.
I stumbled with them and I'm like, oh yeah, this, right? I made this, I took this decision of making me remember this.
Right.
And I can see how in how executive attention works,
I can find something similar because there's this attention that I just stumble with things and I'm just wandering around the keys and the glue and the chip plate and all of this. But there's also like seems to be that there are some cases of attention in which when things are very important for us and we are putting attention to them, we sort of take some decisions that try to heighten the probabilities of us later coming back to them. So I'm trying to study and I put my tools and like a calendar and I take some decisions because I sort of I don't know if that would reflexively, but I know that I'm going to lose my attention. And so I make some decisions so that I'm going to come back to it.
Yeah.
So I can see a model in which there's some part of attention, very important, in which you're sort of bringing attention, it's sort of bringing itself into existence from the past or something like that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about what do you think of this?
Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So there is the marvel of perspective memory. That's amazing. I mean, have you ever set your alarm for an unusual time and then you wake up before the alarm?
Yep.
How do you do that? How do you do that? I mean, you were asleep. That's amazing. But this happens all the time. The perspective memory system is incredible. So you know you have to do something at 5 o'clock, and then you don't have to think about it the rest of the day because you know when the time comes, you remember it. That's amazing. So there's a broader family of things, sometimes called vigilance. So Sam Murray has these great videos on vigilance, and actually, I think what I was calling the dormant mode in inquiry, I call that's like a kind of zetetic vigilance that you have, and that will control. You know, in some way that almost can seem paradoxical, you know, or not paradoxical, kind of a marvel. You know, what is going to come to your attention and when. Now, the difference between my way of thinking about vigilance and describing these things and Murray's is that Murray is theorizing about vigilance as part of the executive system. So he and tied to plans. But I think you can be in states of vigilance that aren't, you know, the result of your decisions. You were interested in ones that are, but I think there's sort of very similar set of capacities to keep yourself sensitive to things that are relevant to to decisions you made or something. And so it's a great idea what you said of like, I want to remember where I left off. Oh yeah. You know, so let me do all these things so that when I go back to this task, I will remember where I was. I don't have to. You know, that's a very good thing to do. If you don't do that, that could be like a big problem. That's not vigilance, but that's an example of doing something so that your attention to control your future self's attention. But it's not, and I just want to emphasize that it isn't just this sort of highly orchestrated, I'll write down like a bookmark is basically like this. You put the bookmark in so you know what part of the book to go back to. That's very simple. But perspective memory is something different. Perspective memory is like a bookmark where you didn't have to do any external thing, it just happens. And then vigilance is a version of that same sort of capacity to keep yourself attuned to information that you don't know when it's going to come up. But because you're in a state of vigilance, you don't know when you're going to encounter some information or come upon a situation that's relevant to one thing you are in the middle of doing or thinking about. But because of your vigilance system, if it is a system, anyway, because of your vigilance capacities, you will, tune yourself. Thank
you very much.
So, we are finishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.